My name's Thomas M. Lur, and I've always had a fascination with the unknown. You could say it comes with the territory. I'm a historian who's spent years digging into ancient European rituals, those eerie practices people whispered about but rarely documented. Living in Berlin has its perks, especially for someone like me who thrives on the rich history this city has to offer. But my life took a turn I never anticipated when I found myself knee-deep in a mystery I wasn't prepared for. It all started in the dusty basement of an old library, a place forgotten by time, and I assumed by everyone else. I was sifting through piles of letters, each one more mundane than the last, when I stumbled upon something that immediately piqued my interest, a tattered envelope that seemed out of place among the rest. Inside was a letter, dated 1803, written in a hurried hand that seemed desperate to convey a warning. The letter spoke of a ritual performed in a dense forest just outside Berlin, a ritual meant to summon something dark, something that should never have been disturbed. The writer went on to describe the horrors that followed, claiming that whatever was awakened during that ritual had never truly gone back to sleep. As I read those words, a chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of skepticism that had settled in. After all, I'd read countless tales like this one, stories meant to scare, not to be taken seriously. But there was something different about this letter. Maybe it was the urgency in the writing, or the fact that it had been hidden away, almost as if someone wanted it to be forgotten. Whatever the reason, I couldn't let it go. The idea of a dark ritual taking place so close to home, in a forest I'd probably driven past dozens of times, was too intriguing to ignore. I decided right then and there that I needed to see this place for myself, to find out if there was any truth to the story. Of course, the rational part of me kept insisting that it was all just a myth, but there was another part, a part that thrived on the thrill of the unknown, that couldn't wait to uncover the secrets hidden in those woods. I spent the next few days preparing for the trip, poring over maps and old texts to pinpoint the exact location mentioned in the letter. The forest wasn't far from the city, just a short drive away, yet it was isolated enough to make it the perfect setting for something sinister. As the day of my journey approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and dread. It's funny, really, how the mind works, how curiosity can drive you toward things that, deep down, you know you should probably stay away from. But I was committed, and nothing was going to stop me from seeing this through. The morning of my departure was overcast, the kind of weather that seems to promise rain, but never delivers. I packed my bag with the essentials: a flashlight, some water, and the letter that had set everything in motion. As I locked up my apartment, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality, as if I was closing the door on one chapter of my life and stepping into something entirely different. The drive to the forest was uneventful, the roads eerily quiet for a weekday morning. But the closer I got to my destination, the heavier the air seemed to become, almost as if the forest was aware of my approach and was waiting for me. When I finally arrived, I parked at the edge of the woods and sat there for a moment, staring into the dense tangle of trees that stretched out before me. This was at the place where, according to the letter, unimaginable horrors had been unleashed. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bag, and stepped out of the car. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but I couldn't turn back now. I had come too far, and the pull of the unknown was too strong to resist. As I walked toward the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was waiting for me just beyond the shadows. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and the letter that had haunted my thoughts, I stepped into the forest, the air thick with an eerie stillness. The trees towered above me, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, almost as if they were reaching out to grab anyone foolish enough to venture too close. Each step I took was met with the crunch of leaves underfoot, but it felt like the sound was swallowed up by the dense woods. As I walked deeper into the forest, a strange sense of unease settled over me, like I had crossed some invisible threshold into a place where the usual rules didn't apply. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting for me to make a wrong move. The directions in the letter were vague at best, but I did my best to follow them, keeping an eye out for any landmarks that might guide me. The deeper I went, the darker it became, with the trees blocking out most of the light. It wasn't long before I started to notice strange markings on the ground circles, pentagrams, and runes that didn't match any symbol I had ever seen in my studies. I knelt down to get a better look, running my fingers over the dirt, feeling the grooves of the markings as if they were etched into the earth itself. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized these weren't just random carvings, they had a purpose, one I couldn't quite grasp yet. As I continued on, the forest seemed to close in around me, the path becoming narrower and more treacherous. Every now and then, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just more trees, standing silent and imposing. It was getting harder to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, that something unseen was tracking my every move. But I pushed on, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear, determined to find the place described in the letter. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw them, the symbols carved into the bark of several trees, just as the letter had described. They were old, weathered by time, but still distinct enough to make out. The sight of them sent a cold chill down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. The trees stood like sentinels, guarding the secrets of the forest, and I couldn't help but wonder what those secrets might be. It was then that I realized just how deep I had gone into the woods, and just how far I was from the safety of the city. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me. The symbols were more than just carvings, they were a warning, a reminder of the ritual that had taken place here over 2 centuries ago. And yet, there was something about them that felt unfinished, like the ritual was still waiting to be completed. A sense of dread began to creep in, but I couldn't turn back now. I had come too far, and the answers I sought were somewhere in this forest, hidden among the shadows and the trees. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the feeling of being watched more intense. I tried to shake off the fear that was building inside me, reminding myself that I was a historian, a man of logic and reason. But the deeper I ventured, the harder it became to hold onto that belief. The forest was changing, becoming something darker, more sinister, and I couldn't help but feel that I was no longer in control of where I was going. It was as if the forest itself was guiding me, leading me toward something I wasn't ready to face. After what felt like hours of wandering, I finally stumbled upon a small clearing in the heart of the forest. The trees parted just enough to reveal a stone altar, standing solemnly in the center of the open space. It was ancient, cracked in several places, and covered in a thick layer of moss, yet it seemed to pulse with an energy that was anything but lifeless. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. There was a strange, unsettling beauty to it, like something that belonged in a forgotten age, hidden from the eyes of the world. Around the altar, the ground was littered with remnants of what could only have been part of the ritual, the charred remains of candles, bones that had long since lost their flesh, and dark stains on the earth that looked eerily like dried blood. As I moved closer, the atmosphere in the clearing shifted. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My heart raced as I took in the scene before me, a chilling realization dawning. This was the place, the very spot where the ritual had been performed all those years ago. I couldn't help but feel that I was standing in the midst of something far bigger than I had anticipated, something dark and powerful that was still very much alive. The altar seemed to radiate a malevolent force, one that I could feel tugging at the edges of my consciousness, drawing me in against my will. I reached out to touch the surface of the altar, my fingers brushing against the cold stone. As soon as I made contact, a sharp pain shot through my hand, forcing me to pull back. It was as if the altar itself had rejected me, warning me to stay away. The symbols carved into the surrounding trees caught my eye once more, and I realized they weren't just for decoration. They formed a perfect circle around the clearing, as if to contain whatever dark forces had been summoned here. The more I looked at them, the more I felt that they were not just part of a forgotten past, but a living, breathing part of the present. Despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something about this place, something that called to me on a deeper level, urging me to stay and uncover its secrets. The logical part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to abandon this foolish quest and return to the safety of the city. But the historian in me, the one who had spent years chasing after lost knowledge, couldn't resist the allure of the unknown. I needed to understand what had happened here, why this ritual had been performed, and what it had awakened. As I continued to explore the clearing, I began to piece together fragments of a story, one of desperation, fear, and dark ambition. Whoever had performed the ritual had done so with a purpose, one that went far beyond mere curiosity. The bones scattered around the altar told a tale of sacrifice, and the bloodstains hinted at a price that had been paid in full. But the question that haunted me the most was whether the ritual had succeeded, or if it had gone horribly, horribly wrong. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees standing like silent witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded here. The sense of being watched was almost unbearable now, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me from all sides. I knew that whatever had been summoned during the ritual was still here, trapped within the boundaries of the circle, waiting for the moment it could be set free. And as much as I wanted to turn and run, to escape the oppressive darkness of this place, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now would only make things worse. The forest had claimed me, and there was no turning back. The nightmares started almost immediately after my visit to the forest. Each night, as soon as I closed my eyes, I was plunged into a world of darkness, where hooded figures stood in a circle around the altar, their faces obscured by shadows. They chanted in a language I couldn't understand, their voices rising and falling like a sinister melody that echoed in my mind long after I awoke. But it wasn't just the chanting that haunted me, it was their eyes, glowing red like embers in the dark, watching me with a malevolence that made my blood run cold. Every morning, I would wake up drenched in sweat, the images from the dreams seared into my memory, as vivid as if I had actually been there. The worst part was that the nightmares weren't just confined to my sleep. During the day, I would catch glimpses of the hooded figures out of the corner of my eye, only for them to vanish the moment I turned to look. The whispers, too, followed me wherever I went, a constant murmur in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the forest had followed me home, its darkness creeping into every corner of my life, refusing to let me go. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the more I tried, the worse it got. Desperate for answers, I returned to the forest, hoping to find anything that would explain what was happening to me. But when I arrived, I immediately knew that something had changed. The symbols on the trees, once faded and weathered by time, were now glowing faintly, as if they had been freshly carved. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. And then there were the whispers, no longer a faint murmur, but a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from all around me, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. The ground beneath the altar had started to shift, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat, as if something was trying to break free from beneath the earth. I stood there, frozen in place, as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The ritual wasn't over. It had never ended. I had unknowingly triggered something when I entered the forest, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now it was coming back to life, piece by piece, drawing power from the very land it was performed on. Panic set in as I tried to think of a way to stop it, but the more I thought, the more helpless I felt. How do you stop something that's been in motion for over 200 years? How do you fight a force that's older, darker, and more powerful than anything you've ever known? The weight of my own insignificance pressed down on me, and for the first time, I truly understood the gravity of what I had gotten myself into. This wasn't just a story from the past, it was real. It was happening right now, and there was no going back. The forest was alive with the energy of the ritual, the air crackling with a power that was both ancient and malevolent. I could feel it in my bones, in the very marrow of my being, a force that was beyond human comprehension, driven by a purpose that I could only begin to grasp. And as I stood there, watching the ground pulse and the symbols glow, I knew that whatever had been awakened wasn't just confined to the forest. It was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The ritual had begun again, and I was at the center of it, a pawn in a game I didn't understand, but one that I could no longer escape. As the days went by, my life began to spiral out of control. The once peaceful sanctuary of my home became a prison, haunted by voices that wouldn't stop whispering in the dead of night. Every time I tried to sleep, the nightmares would return, more vivid and terrifying than before. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights. The hooded figures from my dreams had followed me into the waking world, their presence a constant shadow on the edge of my vision. I knew they were there, watching, waiting for something I couldn't fathom, but that I feared with every fiber of my being. My work, once my refuge, now seemed meaningless. I could barely concentrate, my mind always drifting back to the forest, to the altar, to the ritual that had begun to consume my thoughts. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what awaited me in the darkness. The lack of rest took its toll. I became irritable, paranoid, convinced that the people around me could see the terror that had taken hold of my soul. But every time I tried to explain, to make someone understand, they would just look at me with pity, their eyes filled with disbelief. They thought I was losing my mind, that I had become too obsessed with my work, but they couldn't see what I saw. They didn't know the truth. The forest, the cursed place where it all began, seemed to be calling to me, its dark presence growing stronger with each passing day. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing fear that wouldn't go away. It was as if the forest itself was alive, pulling me back, demanding that I return to finish what had been started. I tried to resist, to fight the urge to go back, but the more I struggled, the stronger it became. It was like a voice in the back of my mind, whispering, coaxing, telling me that I had no choice, that there was no escape from what I had awakened. I began to see things that weren't there, or at least, I hoped they weren't. Shadows that moved on their own, doors that creaked open when no one was around, and those eyes, always those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness. I knew that whatever had been summoned during the ritual wasn't done with me yet, that it was just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I felt trapped, cornered by an enemy I couldn't see, but could feel with every breath I took. And the worst part was, I knew that I was the only one who could stop it, or at least try. I tried to research, to find a way to undo what had been done, but every lead I followed seemed to end in a dead end. The more I searched, the more desperate I became, until finally I realized the horrible truth. There was no way to stop it. The ritual was older than anything I had ever encountered, its power rooted in forces that were beyond human comprehension. I had unleashed something that could not be contained, something that would keep coming until it had taken everything. And I was powerless to do anything about it. My isolation grew, as did the fear that had taken hold of my heart. I stopped answering calls, stopped seeing friends, retreating further and further into myself. I was consumed by the darkness, both literal and figurative, that had invaded my life. The hooded figures were no longer just in the shadows, they were everywhere, in every reflection, every flicker of light, always watching, always waiting. I could feel myself slipping, losing my grip on reality, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. The ritual was alive, and it was coming for me, and there was no one who could help. I couldn't take it anymore, the fear, the voices, the constant feeling of being watched. I knew there was only one way to put an end to the nightmare that had become my life. I had to go back to the forest, back to the place where it all began, and confront whatever it was that had been awakened. It was a decision born out of desperation, but I didn't see any other choice. I had to face it, even if it meant losing everything. The thought of returning to that cursed place filled me with dread, but I knew I couldn't run forever. It was time to finish this, one way or another. The journey back to the forest felt like a death march. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the trees seemed to close in around me as I approached the clearing. The whispers that had plagued my mind were now screams, echoing in my ears, demanding that I turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. The altar came into view, glowing with an eerie light that seemed to pulsate in time with my racing heart. The ground beneath it was no longer solid. It had begun to crack, revealing a darkness that seemed to have no end. I knew in that moment that the ritual was nearing completion, and that I was the final piece. The hooded figures from my nightmares were there, surrounding the altar, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. They had been waiting for me, and now that I was there, I could feel their power, their hatred, bearing down on me. The forest itself seemed to tremble as the ground continued to give way, the earth splitting apart beneath my feet. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think, as the realization washed over me. Like a wave of ice, I was the sacrifice. The ritual had been waiting for me all along, drawing me in, manipulating me, until I was right where it wanted me. There was no escape. The darkness was closing in, the screams growing louder, more desperate, as the ground beneath me finally gave way. I felt myself being pulled into the void, surrounded by the hooded figures, their faces still hidden, but their eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to sear my very soul. I could feel the earth crumbling beneath me, my body sinking into the darkness, as the last remnants of my strength ebbed away. This was the end. There was no coming back from this. The ritual had been completed, and I had played my part perfectly. As I was dragged into the abyss, I realized with a sickening clarity that this had been my fate all along. From the moment I found that letter, I had been marked, chosen by forces beyond my understanding. The darkness was all-encompassing now, swallowing me whole as the hooded figures closed in, their chants growing louder, more insistent. I tried to scream, to fight back, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. I could feel it pulling me deeper, stripping away my very essence, until there was nothing left but the cold, empty void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I was alone, floating in the darkness, with no sense of time, no sense of self. The hooded figures were gone, the altar a distant memory, and all that remained was the cold, suffocating blackness. I had become part of the ritual, bound to it for eternity, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The forest had claimed me, and there was no one left to remember the man I had once been. The ritual had ended, but my torment was only just beginning. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the feeling of being pulled into that abyss, the cold, suffocating void that seemed to stretch on forever. When I finally came to, I was back in my study, sitting at my desk as if nothing had happened. But everything was different. The letter that had started this nightmare lay open in front of me, its edges worn and tattered, as though it had been read and reread 1,000 times. But the words were different, now no longer a warning, but a command. One word stood out among the rest, burned into the paper as if by fire. Run. The urgency of that single word sent a jolt of fear through me, but I knew, deep down, that it was already too late. I could feel them, those same hooded figures from the forest, the ones that had haunted my nightmares and plagued my every waking moment. They were here, lurking just out of sight, their presence a constant, oppressive weight on my chest. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. I wasn't alone anymore. They had followed me back, or maybe they had never left. Either way, I knew they were waiting for the right moment to strike, to finish what they had started in the forest. The ritual wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I sat there, paralyzed by fear, I realized the true horror of my situation. The forest, the altar, the ritual, it had all been leading up to this moment. The darkness I had encountered wasn't just confined to that cursed place. It had found its way into my home, into my very soul. There was no escaping it. The hooded figures, those malevolent beings that had been waiting in the shadows, were now in control. They had taken everything from me, my peace, my sanity, my life, and now they were here to claim the final piece. The world outside my window seemed distant, almost unreal, as if I was looking at it through a fog. I could hear the sounds of the city cars passing by, people going about their lives, but they felt foreign to me, like they belonged to someone else. My reality had shifted, warped by the darkness that now consumed me. The lines between dream and reality had blurred beyond recognition, and I was trapped in a waking nightmare with no way out. I could feel the pull of the forest, the call of the ritual, stronger than ever before. It was as if the very walls of my study were closing in on me, pushing me back toward the darkness I had tried so desperately to escape. But there was no escaping it. I knew that now. The ritual had claimed me, body and soul, and there was nothing left to do but accept my fate. The hooded figures were drawing closer, their presence more palpable with each passing second. I could feel their eyes on me, burning into my skin, watching my every move. They were waiting for the moment when I would finally give in, when I would stop resisting and let the darkness take me. And as much as I wanted to fight, to run, to escape, I knew it was pointless. The ritual had been completed, and I was its final victim. With a sense of resignation, I picked up the pen that lay on my desk and began to write. I didn't know what else to do. The words flowed from me, almost as if guided by some unseen force, detailing everything that had happened, every horror I had experienced. It was as if I needed to leave some record, some proof of what I had gone through, even if no one would ever believe it. But as I wrote, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all for nothing, that the hooded figures were just waiting for me to finish so they could take the last piece of me that remained. The ritual would never end, and neither would my torment. And as I penned the final words, I knew that this would be my last act in a world that no longer belonged to me.